Perfecto. Bueno, muy buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches a todos y a todas. Seguimos felices porque acabamos de tener una magnífica entrevista, interacción con una de las más grandes figuras del pensamiento contemporáneo, como es Peter Singer, pero ahora no somos menos, ahora tenemos a otra enorme estrella rutilante del firmamento académico mundial, intelectual mundial, que es nada menos y nada más que Nick Bostrom. Quiero presentarles a nuestro invitado para quienes no lo conocen. Nick Bostrom es un filósofo sueco que tiene estudios en física, en neurociencia computacional, en lógica matemática y también en filosofía. Él es muy conocido por sus trabajos fundamentalmente en 5 áreas: en riesgo existencial, el argumento de la simulación, la antrópica, desarrollando modelos matemáticos para explicar, digamos, los efectos de la acción humana en el futuro, los impactos de la tecnología futura y las implicaciones del consecuencialismo y el utilitarismo en la estrategia global. Él es director del Instituto para el Futuro de la Humanidad de la Universidad de Oxford y profesor de ética aplicada en la misma universidad. Es autor de más de 200 publicaciones y sus escritos han sido traducidos a más de 30 idiomas. Indudablemente, Nick es una de las mentes más brillantes de nuestra época. Professor Bostrom is a Swedish-born philosopher with a background in theoretical physics, computational neuroscience, and mathematical logic, as well as philosophy. He's best known for his work in 5 areas: existential risks, the simulation argument, anthropics, developing the first mathematically explicit theory of observation selection effects, impacts of future technologies, and implications of consequentialism for global strategy. He is the director at the Oxford Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, and director of the Oxford Martin Program on the Impacts of Future Technology, and also professor of applied ethics at the same university. He's the author of some 200 publications, and his writing has been translated into 30 languages at least. Undoubtedly, my friends, Nick is one of the most brilliant minds of our time. Nick, you're very welcome. Thank you very much for having accepted our invitation to this interview. I know you have made some room in your tight schedule, and today you are with us from Montreal, Canada. So we really appreciate that.
Thank you. That's over generous, but yeah, let's get started.
Thank you. So let's start. Primero le voy a preguntar a Nick, digamos, ¿cómo se considera él? Porque tiene tantos estudios en tantas áreas del pensamiento humano que uno no sabe si es científico, matemático, filósofo. Entonces quiero preguntarle primero, como para ir rompiendo el hielo, ¿cómo se considera él mismo? Nick, you have backgrounds in philosophy, physics, mathematics, mathematical logic, computational neuroscience, and analytic philosophy, because I understand you have also studied Quine, for example. So, and just to stop counting. So, and you currently work on all those fields. How would you describe yourself? Are you a scientist, a mathematician, a philosopher, and why?
It's always been hard for me to label myself. I guess if I have to pick one, I'd say maybe philosopher, because it's broad enough that it can kind of be, you can call almost anything sort of philosophy. But I'm not really doing all these things in parallel. I'm more like a butterfly, maybe, that is kind of moving from flower to flower and collecting insights.
Ok, perfect. Dice Nick que es un poco difícil describirse porque claramente él tiene, digamos, backgrounds en muchas áreas, pero él diría que es principalmente un filósofo, ¿cierto? Un pensador que ha desarrollado su pensamiento más bien desde esa área, pero también le gusta, digamos, autodefinirse como si fuese una mariposa que va de flor en flor, como que todas estas áreas, digamos, del conocimiento son flores de las cuales uno puede ir libando, y él va libando de todas ellas como si fuese una mariposa. Le quiero preguntar a Nick, él es el director fundador del Instituto para el Futuro de las Humanidades, pero le quiero hacer una pregunta, algo así como una tricky question, porque él piensa en el futuro de la humanidad. Yo le digo, ¿por qué no pensar en el presente? A ver, veamos para que nos explique un poco por qué crea este instituto. Nick, you are the founding director of the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. There, you and your team work on topics related to humanity and its prospect. So my question is, why better not to think of the present of humanity instead of its future?
When there needs to be people thinking about both. I think there are a lot more people currently, in fact, almost everybody is very much focused on the present or the immediate future. And I think there's a deficit of careful thought being given to the longer prospects. And so, yeah, because it's relatively neglected, I thought that would be an area where there is maybe the greatest opportunity to make some positive contribution by an institute such as the Future of Humanity Institute.
But I think you not only think in the immediate future, you only think in a far future. What is important to think in a very far future?
Yeah, I mean, really the main reason I'm interested in the far future is insofar as it has relevance for what we should be doing in the present. So you can, if you don't have any kind of view about where you might end up, what different paths might lead to, you're in a sense working in the dark. We have no real way of telling whether we're even making progress as we are advancing, or whether we are actually going in a direction that makes things worse. And so I think gaining some conception of the bigger picture in which we are operating is necessary for that. Otherwise, it's a little bit like an ant hill, you know, where all the ants are very busy, each doing their little thing, but they have no conception of what they're actually building. You know, whether they're building a wonderful home for all the ants, or whether they are like soldiers in Hitler's war machine, contributing maybe with heroic self-sacrifice, but contributing to a bad purpose. And so you need to sort of zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture to have an opinion about those things.
So, Nick, for people who don't know, you are a utilitarian or consequentialist thinker?
Actually not, no. I mean, okay. I'm commonly believed to be that. And because I have written some papers that explore the consequences of utilitarianism. I've argued that if you do take a utilitarian perspective, then various very strange and striking things follow. For example, that existential risk mitigation should be our dominant concern, and that it's more important than everything else. My actual view is more complex. I would place some weight on this kind of utilitarian perspective, but I would also incorporate other moral perspectives in my overall decision-making.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nick. Nick dice, bueno, sí es verdad que se piensa en el futuro de la humanidad, pero en rigor ellos piensan en el instituto en ambos, tanto en el presente como en el futuro. Pero sí cree que hay un déficit en pensar en el futuro. La mayoría de la gente está en el aquí y en el ahora, pensando en el presente, pero se olvida de el impacto de las acciones presentes en el futuro, y eso, digamos, es una actitud que nosotros deberíamos tener. O sea, nosotros no deberíamos pensar solamente en lo que hacemos en el aquí y ahora, sino que deberíamos pensar también en los impactos que esto tiene para el futuro de la humanidad. Hay un déficit importante. Es importante, ¿cierto?, pensar en el futuro, precisamente porque eso nos puede hacer cuestionarnos con mayor claridad lo que estamos haciendo en el presente. Si nosotros no visionamos los efectos de nuestra acción presente, ¿cierto?, en el futuro, vivimos en una mayor oscuridad en el presente, dice, ¿cierto?, Nick. No podríamos preguntarnos por nosotros y nuestros sentidos sin pensar en las consecuencias de lo que hacemos. Viviríamos en mayor oscuridad. Esto es como lo que hacen las hormigas, dice, él hace una analogía con las hormigas que van en filita y construyen una cadena hacia el futuro, y el que está en el presente, en ese sentido, no está desconectado del futuro, y eso mismo ocurre, ¿cierto?, con nosotros. Él a la vez dice que independientemente de que ellos piensen en las consecuencias de nuestras acciones, ellos no es realmente un utilitarista ni un consecuencialista. Su visión teórica es mucho más compleja. Una de sus, digamos, epistemologías que utiliza el utilitarismo, pero no es completamente utilitarista. Entonces le voy a preguntar, él habló justamente del riesgo existencial, entonces le quiero preguntar un poco, digamos, qué significa, digamos, riesgo existencial y por qué es importante, digamos, pensar en eso. Nick, in the framework of your previous answer, I think you are inaugurated the concept of existential risks. by analyzing diverse human extinction scenarios. However, some of those scenarios can take so long to happen. So could you please explain to the audience what existential risk is and why it's important for us to take it into consideration now in our present? Is existential risk a mere hypothesis, or is something that can really happen?
Well, an existential risk is a risk of either Earth originating life, intelligent life going extinct, sort of humanity being wiped out, or some other ways that we could permanently destroy the future. So by locking ourselves into some radically suboptimal state. Think maybe a global oppressive totalitarian regime that you could never overthrow. That might be in the ballpark as bad as extinction. And the reason for having a kind of concept for this set of possible outcomes is that the stakes are very large. If you do care, say, about the future from a utilitarian perspective, if we bring that in, right, then there's just so much more of the future than there is present. If things go well for humanity, maybe, in millions of years, we will have colonized, the galaxy and then beyond, and that could just be trillions and trillions of more people living in the future than live at the present. So even a small probability affecting such a huge set of potential people would weigh very heavily in the utilitarian calculation. And so therefore, on this set of ethical perspectives, there is a huge difference between, say, 99% of all humans dying in a giant disaster and 100% of all humans dying in a disaster. In the 99% case, there's 1% left, and after 1,000 years, maybe we'll be back to where we are now. Whereas if 100% die, then there is no future. So this is an example where, depending on your values, you get very different answers. On the one hand, like you might say that the difference between nobody dying and 99% dying is much bigger, because that's like, more than 7 billion people, right? But whereas the difference between 99% dying and 100% dying would just be like 70 million people. But from this other point of view that takes into account the future, that last percentage just makes vastly more difference. Now, so even if you thought the probability was quite small, if you did happen to be this kind of utilitarian, then you might still pay a lot of attention to this. As it happens, I think there are significant existential risks now and over the coming decades in this century, because I think there will be some key technological transitions that humanity will make with artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, nanotech, maybe some other things as well that we haven't thought of. And that these will be associated with significant existential risk. But if we do get through this, then the future might be much safer for us, and we might then have billions of years ahead of us. So this is a kind of test time for humanity. And one of the reasons I wanted to was keen to speak to you guys is that I think biotechnology is one of a small number of places where we might see significant, existential risk, but also less than existential risk if we're just talking sort of mere global catastrophic risk over the coming years. So we need to sort of start to get our act together. I think it's been a little bit of a wild west in biotechnology, and we will at some point need to move to a more regulated and structured way of advancing this field, I think.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nick. Nick dice, bueno, ¿qué es el riesgo existencial? El riesgo existencial fundamentalmente apunta al riesgo de nuestra extinción, ¿cierto? Por eso el riesgo existencial, el riesgo de que se extinga la humanidad en algún punto del tiempo futuro. En ese sentido, tiene que ver con la posibilidad de que, fundamentalmente por causa humana, se destruya completamente la posibilidad de un futuro para la humanidad. Porque podrían existir también otros riesgos existenciales que, no sé, un asteroide que acabe la Tierra, él lo definiría como riesgo catastrófico, pero pueden haber riesgos que no dependan completamente de nosotros, pero fundamentalmente el riesgo existencial es el riesgo de la autodestrucción, ¿cierto? Por muchas causas. Y dice que es relevante pensar en esto, si nosotros realmente queremos pensar en las generaciones futuras, porque incluso si él hace unas cuentas, ¿no? Porcentuales, incluso si nosotros pensáramos que vamos a dañar a una pequeña porción de la humanidad, si solo, por ejemplo, ocasionáramos un daño que impactara el 1% de la gente viva, eso ya son 70 millones de personas que serían impactadas, lo cual no es menor. Por lo tanto, no es irrelevante pensar, digamos, en esos impactos que claramente tienen, digamos, un componente moral. O sea, hay un componente moral en pensar en la posibilidad de un daño futuro. Y por lo mismo él dice que estamos en una época de transición tecnológica y por lo mismo es una época de prueba para nosotros. Estamos en un tiempo, en un test time, o sea, en un tiempo de prueba para probarnos a nosotros mismos a ver qué vamos a hacer con esto. Es un tiempo de prueba para la humanidad. Entonces, es creer que es muy relevante pensar en el tema de riesgo existencial porque es el riesgo de nuestra extinción y tiene claramente un componente moral indiscutible. Quiero preguntarle, se me ocurre, a propósito de lo que acaba de responder, ¿cierto? Nick ha trabajado mucho en el tema del transhumanismo y el poshumanismo, ¿cierto? Yo quiero preguntarle si el transhumanismo y el poshumanismo serían una suerte de riesgo existencial en el sentido de que nosotros podríamos ser reemplazados por transhumanos y poshumanos en el futuro. Nick, according to what you have said, could we consider the possibility of a transhumanist or even a posthumanist society a kind of existential risk in the sense that it could replace at some point the whole humanity society, the whole humanity, which somehow would imply our extinction, our species? Do you have any problem in thinking about us being replaced by transhumanist or post-humanist entities?
Yeah, I think that at least some versions of a transition into some transhuman or post-human future could in fact be very good and preserve the things that are worth preserving about humanity. I don't think we have sort of reached the highest possible point out of all the different kinds of being that could exist or that we could become the current version of humanity. It's hard to think that this is like as good as it could possibly get. And so, in fact, I would regard it as an existential catastrophe if we forever lost the potential for developing further and maybe one day becoming post-human, or for people to have the option to have longer and healthier lifespans or to increase their mental powers or in other ways overcome some of our biological limitations. On the other hand, I think there are many different ways that this transition to a post-human era could go wrong. And so there would definitely be many ways of this being an existential catastrophe as well. The unwise ways in which we could modify ourselves to become kind of less than human or like to lose a lot of what is really valuable and just amplify one aspect of our humanity and, you know, sacrificing others. So I think my preferred path would be one where we can continue to develop and eventually maybe become something far bigger than humans, but that the transition should happen gradually and be a matter of people having choices and then somehow more wisdom guiding this process than is currently the case, where we are more kind of heedlessly rushing into an unknown future.
But in that transition you're talking about, so it's possible a kind of coexistence in the future between transhumans and humans. What would be that? So would we need a kind of new law, new ethics to regulate, to govern that kind of coexistence between humans and transhumans or post-humans even?
Probably there would have to be a lot of rethinking about our social structures and so forth. And it's very hard to do all of that in advance from our current vantage point. I think as we move closer, we will have to resolve various issues that come up. One particularly tricky dimension of this, which I've recently been doing some thinking about, we have a research group set up on this, is the ethics of digital minds. So if we have artificial intelligences that are becoming increasingly capable and sophisticated year by year, at some point we will have maybe AI systems that are kind of comparable to animals in terms of their cognitive repertoire and the number of neurons they have in their neural networks and so forth. Maybe, initially something kind of analogous to a rat in terms of its ability to learn, and then maybe, increasingly sophisticated animals, maybe ultimately human equivalent or super intelligent, as I have described in my other work. But even when we just get something comparable to animals, we think that animals are moral subjects, in that there are certain things that are wrong to do, like wrong to kick your dog for no reason, or if you want to perform experiments on animals, there is an animal experimentation ethics, like you have to anesthetize a rat before you do surgery and so forth, because we think it can suffer. And so similarly, if you start to have these digital minds that are comparable to animal minds, I think the issue then arises whether they are also moral subjects to various degrees. And this is quite a hard thing to think about, because there are so many assumptions we have that will need to be rethought when we're considering digital minds. There are things you can't do with biological creatures or humans, but like making copies. You can run something faster or slower. You can pause something and then restart it later. You can go in and edit any little part of the mind. You can have maybe architectures that look very different from the architectures of a biological creature, that provide the same kind of intelligent behavior, but through a very different structure. So there's a lot of theoretical groundwork to be done on that front. But I think it's starting to get time for at least some people to begin to think about these issues now.
Perfect. Nick, I'm going to translate your answer. Nick dice que, bueno, que hay versiones sobre esta transición desde lo humano a lo transhumano, lo cual podría eventualmente provocar una catástrofe existencial. Él no está tan seguro, digamos, de cuán cierto es la posibilidad de esto. Pero yo después le retruco y le digo, bueno, pero al menos existe la posibilidad de que en algún punto del futuro coexistamos humanos y transhumanos. Eso ya creemos que es una posibilidad más o menos cierta. Entonces, él dice, claro, eso es así porque el ser humano tiene, ¿cierto?, la necesidad y el ímpetu actual de aumentar el poder sobre nuestras limitaciones, o sea, tiene oportunidades para efectuar una transición, y en ese sentido, ¿cierto?, es probable que necesitemos de una nueva estructura social para regular y gobernar, ¿cierto?, la convivencia entre transhumanos y humanos. Él habla de lo que ha estado trabajando recientemente, que es la ética sobre las mentes digitales, digital minds, ¿cierto? Él dice, o sea, ¿qué pasaría en una convivencia entre mentes digitales y mentes biológicas que son más capaces que nosotros, ¿cierto? Entonces, evidentemente habría que ser muy cuidadoso y evidentemente habría que determinar nuevas estructuras sociales para poder regular eso, que lo que sí cree él puede ser posible. O sea, él sí cree que es posible una coexistencia futura, digamos, entre transhumanos y humanos, lo cual implicaría un cambio radical en toda la estructura social. Yo le pregunté si habría un cambio en la ética y en el derecho, y él cree que también. Le voy a preguntar, ¿qué pasaría si los computadores y las entidades artificiales se volvieran más inteligentes que nosotros? Nick, what would happen if computers or artificial entities get smarter than we are? So do you think that represents a problem for the future of humanity?
Well, I mean, this is the topic of this book, Superintelligence, that I wrote in, published in 2014. So yeah, I think this will be like maybe the most important event, possibly in all of human history, when this happens. I think we are gradually advancing in machine intelligence. So if progress continues, it will one day occur. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the timescale, but yeah, I think it's one of those things that it will be critical to get this right. This development of super human machine intelligence. And one of the things that has happened in the years since the book came out, and I mean, one of the reasons for writing the book, in fact, in the first place, was to stimulate the growth of this new research field of AI alignment. So it's a technical research field where we are trying to develop scalable ways of aligning AI systems so that even as you sort of make them more and more capable, they will still do what we intend for them to do. And I think it will be very important that we have good solutions for that once we one day gain the capability to build really, really cognitively capable systems. And that's now, I mean, it's been quite encouraging to see different research groups bringing up around the world. And I mean, we are doing a lot of, we have shared seminars with DeepMind in London, and other leading AI developers are also now starting to think about this. Not so much because these techniques are needed today, but because we can kind of, we need to have them ready and ready for deployment, but whenever this future breakthrough happens.
Perfect. Bueno, dice que esto que yo le pregunto es precisamente un tópico que él aborda en un libro que publicó el 2014 que se llama Superintelligence, o sea, superinteligencia, ¿cierto? Artificial, que la superinteligencia sería precisamente la inteligencia de entidades no biológicas, o sea, nosotros somos inteligentes, las entidades no biológicas serían superinteligentes, doctor Cielo, ¿no? Entonces, eso evidentemente dice que él, claramente eso puede ocurrir un día, por algo están trabajando y pensando en eso, y dice, bueno, lo único que yo podría decir es que no sería malo que lográramos ahora probablemente tener buenas soluciones si eso llegase a ocurrir en el futuro, ¿cierto? Cuando, ¿cierto?, los computadores y las entidades artificiales se vuelvan más inteligentes que nosotros, y él relata el hecho de que hay muchos grupos ya de investigación en distintas partes del mundo trabajando en temas de superinteligencia artificial, lo cual indica que no solo hay preocupación, sino que los científicos y los pensadores en el mundo ven esto como algo perfectamente posible, y no a tan largo plazo, sino es posible que no ocurra, digamos, en un futuro, digamos, tan lejano. Le quiero preguntar a propósito de eso, el tema de que si pensar en que la tecnología puede significar un peligro para la vida humana, porque generalmente la tecnología se ve como una panacea, como algo que nos va a ayudar a ser mejores, pero ¿podrá significar también un peligro, o eso es pensar ir demasiado lejos en el pensamiento? Nick, regarding your previous answer, so technology is giving life the potential to flourish like never before, but at the same time, it encompasses the possibility of self-destruction. So people usually don't think about the risks involved in current biotechnologies, for example, and consider those risks to be an exaggeration that lacks objectivity, as bioscience had not yet reached its perfection, and thinking about its potential threats only begets a hypothetical scenario. However, how sure can we be that there's no fatality lurking in new technologies, waiting its time to at best colonize and at worst annihilate our existence? Is thinking that way going too far?
No, I think that biology needs to start to think more like that. We had, like with physics, somewhat of a similar phenomenon, that was a kind of long period when it was just regarded as a field for pure intellectual exploration and fun. And then when it was discovered how to create nuclear weapons, and after Hiroshima, that was a kind of awakening of consciousness in physics, in particular nuclear physics, where people realized that what they were doing was not just pure intellectual exploration, but something with grave real-world consequences. And a lot of the people who had been involved with the Manhattan Project, I think, were kind of reflecting very deeply on that afterwards, their involvement, and many became active in the anti-nuclear movement and so forth, in the peace movement. And I think now it's kind of taken for granted that if you are doing various things related to nuclear weapons science, that some of your research should be classified, and that there are regulations. You can't just have anybody kind of, experimenting with hydrogen bombs. But that same cultural transition has not yet happened in synthetic biology, because it hasn't yet had its Hiroshima. It is possible. I mean, we don't know with this COVID thing. There are obviously speculations that it could have been a lab leak that caused this worldwide pandemic. I think if that somehow were the case, and it's hard to see how, but if we somehow got really conclusive evidence for that might be this kind of wake-up call that would make people realize that biological agents can be just as dangerous, in fact, more dangerous than nuclear weapons, because it's not just located in one place, right? It can spread across the globe. It's not as if there haven't been warning shots. There are been many leaks from biological labs all the time, even very high-level biological safety labs leak organisms repeatedly. It's like a regular thing. It's in the UK, there's this Herbride research facility which has caused a foot and mouth disease outbreak in cattle, which means you have to slaughter all the cows and sheep, and with hundreds of millions of pounds in damage. And this same facility, not just once but twice, has released this and caused a big outbreak. The last smallpox case in the world, I think, was from a kind of lab accident that caused that. And there have been others as well. And I think we need to, substantially increase the safety awareness of this kind of biological work with highly infectious agents.
Perfect, thank you very much. Bueno, dice, muy resumido, porque el tiempo está corriendo, dice Nick que debemos comenzar a pensar así, o sea, a pensar que hay un riesgo escondido, evidentemente, en las biotecnologías, que no todo es panacea, que no todo es el anuncio de una aurora prometida. Da el ejemplo de las armas, o sea, la tecnología crea armas, y no solo armas convencionales, sino armas biológicas, que pueden ser aún más letales, ¿cierto?, que las armas convencionales, y eso es un buen ejemplo de que efectivamente las tecnologías implican un riesgo. Da el ejemplo de Hiroshima, sin ir más lejos, ¿cierto?, de la bomba nuclear. O sea, claramente las tecnologías esconden un riesgo del desastre total. El hecho de que la física esté explorando interestelarmente, digamos, otros lugares también para vivir, implica, digamos, que los científicos están pensando en que puede haber un escenario de destrucción total causado también por las nuevas tecnologías. Entonces dice, como eso es muy posible, él insiste en la idea de transición, ¿cierto?, hacia ese tipo de vida. Es muy importante que nosotros aumentemos sustancialmente la conciencia sobre los peligros que implica la biotecnología. Le quiero preguntar por otra idea controversial, digamos, ¿cierto?, que es el argumento de la simulación, ¿cierto?, que él ha hablado a veces de que nosotros podríamos ser una simulación computacional de una raza más avanzada en el futuro, y eso es una idea que causa mucha controversia en el mundo. Nick, other important idea you have created or worked on is the simulation argument. Is based upon the simulation theory, you know. So even though some people might think that your epistemological approaches to that topic seems like science fiction, which would dwindle its validity and veracity, I think the argument is compelling enough if you look at it thoroughly. Could you please explain to the audience why you consider such argument important enough to be taken into consideration in which its premises are?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that opens up a whole can of worm in its own right. We could have a long conversation just about the simulation argument. So I don't want us to maybe go too far afield in that direction. Yeah, I mean, the basic key core premises, I think, is on the one hand, a substrate independence thesis, which says that in principle you could have human-like minds and human-like experiences generated by other substrates than biological matter, like brain tissue. You could instead have, say, computers simulating brains at sufficient levels of resolution and get the same experiences from that. So the substrate independence thesis is somewhat controversial, but I think probably the majority of people in philosophy of mind or neuroscience would accept it, but not all. And then there are some empirical premises coming in as well, which is that a technologically mature civilization that has developed at least all those technologies that we can already see are physically possible, although far beyond our current ability to actually implement. That the technologically mature civilization would be able to create very, very powerful computers and use those computers to run ancestor simulations that would be kind of virtual environments with simulated brains, simulated at the level where they would be conscious, and that this could result in human-like experiences for these simulated creatures. So those would be the two key premises going into the argument.
Okay, I don't know if when you developed the simulation argument, you were thinking on Descartes and his hypothesis of the evil demon, but people, especially God believers, so who don't like your argument, think it implies a profound atheism, or at least a kind of a skepticism. Is a kind of a skepticism or atheism underlying your argument?
No, not at all. I don't see any obvious relation at all, one way or the other, between the simulation hypothesis and different views about God's existence. I mean, I think you could have a universal world created by God in which a lot of things happen, including some people build simulations and some creatures live inside those simulations. Or you could have this thing happen, I guess, in a materialistic universe without God as well. So I think you would need some additional views or ideas if you wanted to connect these two up. I think they are logically independent.
Perfect. And according to that argument, do you think the whole universe could be a fake?
Well, if the simulation hypothesis is true, right, then the parts of the universe that we appear to see, you know, the room around you, and you look out of the window and so forth, the trees outside, those would then be real, but the reality would consist in being simulated on some computer built by some super advanced civilization. And the external reality outside the simulation may or may not resemble the apparent reality inside the simulation. Like it depends on what kind of simulation it is. Like if we think about the simulations we humans create, say computer games or even just literary simulations in novels or movies, like some of those try to be accurate to the real reality, and some are just fantasy worlds. And so similarly with simulations, you might in different kinds of simulations, some of which actually try to track, maybe for scientific purposes, you really try to create an exact, as close as you can to a sort of exact model of some part of the external reality, or you may just do it for other reasons, entertainment reasons, or whatever, where you don't care about the verisimilitude.
Perfect, thank you very much. Bueno, le hice como 3 preguntas seguidas que se me ocurrieron por lo que decía Nick, pero en realidad dice, bueno, el argumento de la simulación es un argumento que está basado en la teoría de la simulación y que tiene que ver con el hecho de que es viable pensar de que los seres humanos pueden desarrollar una tecnología computacional absolutamente avanzada. O sea, ese es el curso que está siguiendo. Entonces, en una teoría de lógica temporal, sería perfectamente plausible pensar que hay una generación futura que ha desarrollado esa lógica computacional tan profunda y tan avanzada, y que perfectamente nosotros podríamos ser una simulación computacional, digamos, de esas entidades. Ahora, le pregunto si hay ateísmo o escepticismo vinculado a esa idea, porque yo me acordé de la idea del Dios maligno, del genio maligno de Descartes, ¿no? Entonces, él me dice no, que no necesariamente, no hay un ateísmo ni un escepticismo necesariamente en su idea, porque perfectamente este podría ser un mundo creado por Dios y perfectamente podrían haber entidades más avanzadas futuras que nos hayan creado nosotros como simulación. No ve contradicción, digamos, en esas 2 ideas, pero que él cree que puede ser posible, digamos, que podríamos ser una simulación y que podría haber una convivencia en este momento de entidades simuladas y entidades biológicas reales, ¿cierto? Evidentemente. Entonces le digo, bueno, en ese sentido, ¿podría ser que pensásemos que todo el universo es una falsedad, es falso? Dice que si nosotros aceptásemos el argumento de la simulación y aceptásemos de que existen, digamos, entidades simuladas, claramente al menos hay una parte del universo que no es real. Entonces, evidentemente, eso más o menos muy resumido lo que dice Nick. Nick nos pidió media hora de entrevista, ya llevamos 45, así que le voy a hacer la última pregunta para no atosigarlo tanto. Nick, we know you are very busy. This is the last question for you, the audience. Via YouTube, there are a lot of people watching you via YouTube right now, so we are not the only ones, so there are a lot of people via YouTube watching you. They are really thrilled to have you with us. So I remember, and I read, I think, some years ago you said that humanity's biggest problems aren't what we think they are. For example, death, I don't know, pollution, greenhouse emissions, famine, cruelty, and the like. By recognizing those are huge problems for the present of humanity, what are the problems for our future? What are the main hazards the future generations will have to deal with?
Well, I mean, I'd say some of those are pretty big problems, like death does seem to be a pretty big problem, at least for the individuals who are currently in existence. But if we're talking about existential risks, then I think, yeah, there are ones that are substantial, I think, arising from this transition to superintelligence. I think from advances in synthetic biology, and those would be two areas where that seem particularly rife. I think depending on how you carve up the pie, as it were, you could carve it up sort of by technology area. But another way is to say, for example, risks arising just from nature, like some asteroid hitting the Earth, versus risks arising from human activity. There, I'd say the ones arising from human activity are by far the largest share. The risks from nature over the next 100 years or 1,000 years are minuscule. But the ones from humans are quite significant, and I think increasing as we develop growing powers to affect the world for better or worse. I think conflict is a major source of existential risk in various direct and indirect ways. We humans tend to use all general purpose technologies we've developed in the past, also for the purpose of waging war against one another or oppressing one another. And so if we develop increasingly powerful technologies in the future, one has to worry that those too will be used for destructive purposes. And the more powerful the technologies, the greater the destruction that could ensue. So the fact that the world remains at the highest level divided into different conflicting nations with different goals that sometimes manage to resolve their differences peacefully, but at other times have to resort to various kinds of conflict, including war, that's a very dangerous situation where we're just like hoping that things will not blow up. But at some point, I think we'll need more robust ways of resolving our differences at that level. So if you count all the different ways that conflict would be a source of existential risk, that might be the biggest one at all, because that could also amplify risks from synthetic biology. You could have new biowarfare programs and so forth driven by conflict that then accidentally or deliberately causes mass destruction. I think even AI is made harder to deal with because of rivalry between nations, where maybe you would want, if there comes a day when we are really close to developing superintelligence, maybe at that point you would want to slow down and really go carefully and make sure the safety works and gradually increase the power of these systems rather than sort of turning them full blast on, right? But if you have many nations racing to get there first, that might just not happen. And so then you might get this rush, and that would increase the risk even of sort of the AI itself by accident creating some major damage. So those would be some of the areas I would point to that are big problems. And I think this question of the ethics of digital minds is another way in which the future might become dystopian. I think that it's likely that the longer term future will be mainly inhabited by digital minds. Most people in the future will be digital. So how they fare will kind of be an important part of the answer to how good the future is. I think it will challenge us to get that right, that we already have a hard enough time extending sympathy to non-human animals in many cases. And with digital minds, it's potentially even more difficult because they don't necessarily have faces, like eyes that can look at you, or they can't squeak. If they're just invisible processes inside some computer, it really will require a lot of empathy, I think, for us to care as we ought to about what they are experiencing.
Perfect. But Nick, if most of Rick's future generation we have to deal with are related to technological transitions and technological empowerment, how could we manage that relationship between technological advances and the future of humanity?
Can you be more precise? I'm not sure.
Yeah, for example, if most risks are related to technological advancements, so, and that is a kind of fate of humanity, how could we manage the relationship between technological transitions, empowerment, and the care of ourselves from technological advancements?
Yeah, I think one has to maybe then look more on a case-by-case basis as to what is feasible. So if we zoom in on biotechnology, for example, I think there are various things on the margin that wouldn't remove all the risk, but that would kind of reduce it a little bit here and reduce it a little bit there. I think the DNA synthesis market really ideally ought to be restructured. So instead of each lab or each person who just feels like it owning their own DNA synthesis machine and then doing with it whatever they please without supervision, I think it would be better if DNA synthesis were provided as a service by 4 or 5 companies worldwide. Researchers would submit their digital blueprint and get back in a vial the DNA sequence that they requested. But then there would be a sort of finite number of choke points, so that if one day like some blueprint for a really dangerous thing were made available, and it's 4 or 5 places you could go to and say, now you need to screen for this. And to a limited extent, this is already happening. So there are like most of DNA synthesis is provided by a few companies, and they do 80% of those are screening the requests. But you really want to have that not 80% but 100%, because if you're an evildoer, right, you will obviously choose to get your DNA synthesis done by one of the 20% that are not doing this. Or you could buy your own DNA synthesis machine. So at the moment, although there are digital blueprints of a lot of really dangerous things in the public domain, like the smallpox genome, like 1918 flu genome, it's still hard to actually synthesize those with today's machines. But as the technology improves, it will become easier and easier, to the point that, in some number of years, you will just be able to download the smallpox print, and then you will have and clearly that can't be a sustainable version. And there are known modifications as well to smallpox that would make it even worse than the original. So this needs to happen, and we might as well do it before something bad is done by these DNA synthesis machines, rather than wait for that to take place. We were discussing earlier about the possibility that COVID might have resulted from a lab leak, but certainly other outbreaks have. That's a clear signal to me that we either shouldn't be doing gain of function research at all, or if we are doing it, it should be under much stricter safety precautions than are currently available. It looks like even BSL-4 labs are not sufficiently secure, since they are in fact leaking. And there's like a track record of repeated occurrences, not just in some like random less developed country, but in America, in the UK, in all the places where these labs exist. So it's, if we're going to do this kind of research at all, which is not clear, but then it should be done just in a few places under extremely high security environment. And there are other things as well. I think investing in technology to make it easier to do like real-time genome surveillance studies, say in sewage water from big cities or in airports, airport toilets and so forth. You could have systems that would kind of in real time analyze DNA, and so you could more quickly detect emerging new outbreaks. and then be able to respond. And the technology there is moving really quickly, so things are feasible to a surprising degree that they wouldn't have been even 5 years ago. And so investing in that, I think, it could be a very good thing to do. And there are other things as well. I think for people working in some of these labs with access to this equipment, there needs to be, I think there needs to be more vetting and surveillance of these people. If they are in fact having access to weapons of mass destruction, like you wouldn't have just anybody with like an undergraduate degree in biology or in physics being able to sort of have direct control over nuclear weapons. But if these biological agents can cause us mass destruction, then you would, I think, need similar vetting of the people working with them. One interesting thing to consider, maybe from a legal point of view, would be whether, as an instrument to get higher safety standards, some form of liability insurance for biolabs, including academic biolabs, is something one could try to push for. Like, I think if universities were actually liable for the potential damage if something is released from the research labs, they might be a lot more cautious if their entire endowment could be wiped out if they like caused another COVID type of thing. So that can be one instrument to like internalize some of the externalities.
Perfect, Nick. Voy a resumir en 2 minutos todo lo que dije, porque lo entusiasmó esta pregunta. Bueno, los principales riesgos, digamos, dice, bueno, son los riesgos existenciales que las generaciones futuras deberán, digamos, enfrentar. La transición a la superinteligencia, los avances en la biología sintética. Entonces, la mayoría de los riesgos, reconociendo, dice él, que hay riesgos también de la naturaleza, ¿cierto? Pero la mayoría de los riesgos son riesgos que estamos causando nosotros mismos. Dice, por ejemplo, los riesgos vinculados a la inteligencia artificial son muy difíciles de combatir y de prevenir, dice. Entonces, el tema de las mentes digitales, digamos, dice claramente hay una indiscutible transición a la digitalidad. O sea, todo va a ser fundamentalmente digital en el futuro. Y eso, aunque plantee una sociedad como distópica, es probablemente lo que va a ocurrir. Entonces, ante eso yo le pregunté después, pero si la mayoría de los riesgos vienen de nosotros, ¿cómo vamos nosotros a manejar, digamos, esa relación? Porque parece ser un destino de la humanidad ser tecnológico. Entonces, estamos condenados a ser tecnológicos, pero entonces estamos condenados a autodestruirnos. Dice, bueno, fundamentalmente lo que debería hacer, deberían ocurrir 4 cosas fundamentales para tratar de manejar un poco esa relación entre la transición tecnológica y nuestro cuidado. La precaución, ¿cierto? Con respecto a lo que se hace tecnológicamente, la seguridad en los procesos, la supervisión y la vigilancia de quienes también llevan a cabo esos procesos. Y algo que puede ser muy interesante para el derecho, dice él, ¿cierto? Y que podría ser una buena forma de internalizar también la importancia de estas cosas, es ver cómo el derecho, digamos, podría generar una nueva responsabilidad legal frente a estos asuntos, cómo las normas también y cuánta intensidad deberían tener las normas para regular estas cosas. Que el derecho se hiciera partícipe de alguna manera de estos asuntos también nos ayudaría mucho a internalizar la importancia de ellos. Nick Bostrom, thank you very much for this interview. It's been a really, a truly pleasure and an honor to have you with us.
Thank you for all of those exciting quesends. I hope it was useful for something.
Thank you very much. We're thrilled to have you here. So it's a truly honor for us. It's very interesting you are sharing with a Latin American audience, you know, so they don't know you so much, so they know your name, but not essentially your thoughts. So I think that it's been something really productive to have you with us. So we're really grateful for you for that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invitation, Eric, and yeah, it was good.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks.
Take care of yourself.